After 10 years of waiting, Final Fantasy XV has finally made it to store shelves, and thousands of people have been wetting themselves in anticipation all this time. To me, well, I honestly didn't care that much about it. Here's my confession. I've never played a Final Fantasy game before. Back in the day when Final Fantasy was good, I was young, like really young. Like I wasn't born yet young, so I never got around to playing any of them. I've always known of their legacy and grew up to be a fan of JRPGs, but then Final Fantasy XIII was out, it was universally panned, and the creator grew a big hard-on for Lightning and decided to make more 13s, and I just kind of gave up on trying to jump into any Final Fantasy games. You see, beating any of these gargantuan RPGs by that point seemed like a distant fantasy to me. See what I did there? But it wasn't until watching gameplay of the episode Duskai demo that I was drawn into FF15 for the stylish combat system. Now, here I am with 60 hours clocked in and a platinum trophy. Final Fantasy XV begins with possibly my favorite starting premise for any RPG I've ever played. A bunch of NSYNC looking dude bros in tight leather on a bachelor party road trip to our main character Prince Noctis' wedding? I'm down for that. From there it gets more complicated as the wedding quickly gets postponed due to more pressing matters, but the premise is still stellar. Now talking about the story gets a little bit tricky. There are basically two stories being told throughout Final Fantasy XV. The first involves a civil war between Lucis, our hero's kingdom, and Niflheim, and the Star Scourge, which is the ever-growing threat of demons and darkness ruling over the world. Meanwhile, the second involves the bond between our four party members, Noctis, Gladiolus, Ignis, and Prompto. The story is at its best when it focuses on the four main characters' growing brotherhood. Each character is distinct and well developed. Noctis is a prissy prince learning to man up and be a king. Ignis is like Noctis' mama who cleans up and feeds the prince. Prompto is the wide-eyed pretty boy with a bad case of the not gaze for Cindy, and Gladiolus is tough guy McMuscles. The game is full of great character moments and banter between the party members. The choice of starting the game with a full party rather than the traditional RPG style of slowly gaining party members over the course of the game was a smart decision that benefits with the kind of story being told. But then there is the other story being told. Now, the overarching main plot of civil war and a world in darkness feels sloppily put together. So much of the plot goes unexplained. Character motivations change off screen, characters just pop into the game without any introduction or explanation as to who they are or what they are doing, and some cutscenes just feel poorly cut together, like the placements of the many flashback sequences. The game, from what I can grasp, seems to have a good to fair story, but the storytelling is painfully bad. Many of these problems stem from vital plot details being locked away behind an anime and movie that are separate products from the game, but even after watching those, there are still plot details that go unexplained in the full game. The story ends up feeling rushed, but a part of it is made up for how strongly they develop its main characters, and especially its main villain, who you will love to hate by the final boss. But the story wasn't what originally got me interested in this game. It was the gameplay that spoke to me first. Final Fantasy XV's gameplay is in real time rather than the more traditional turn-based gameplay style most RPGs of its kind prefer. You have your attack button, which can be held down rather than repeatedly pressed to commence combos, a warp strike button, which closes the gap between you and your enemies by teleporting you on top of enemies for deadly blows, and a block button, which can be held down for defense or pressed at precise times for parrying enemy attacks. The combat is simple, fast, and fun. Combine that with an addictive open-world gameplay loop of going out for hunts and side quests to fight demons, rack up experience points, and then cash all that juicy experience at campsites and rest stops to level up your characters, and you got yourself a time sink fit for a king. I mean, yeah, a lot of the game can boil down to sitting inside your car. Oh, did I mention that you drive a car? Sifting through menus, waiting on loading screens, and holding down the circle button until everything around you is a corpse. But for some reason, it's still engaging to play. Maybe it's because I like to see numbers grow like the video game whore I am. Now, I enjoy the checklist structure that many RPGs and modern AAA games share today, but I feel like games rely too heavily on that kind of approach. I would have loved to see this game resemble The Witcher 3 or Fallout New Vegas, with side quests that had their own engaging stories to tell with interesting encounters that you wanted to experience rather than complete them just to complete them. Out of the 80 plus side quests I did, only 2 of them felt like they fit that criteria. This game falls closer to the Metal Gear Solid 5 approach of side quests. In fact, this game reminds me a lot of Metal Gear Solid 5. You've got this highly anticipated AAA open world game with a massive scope, and even though you can tell a lot of money was put behind this game, you still get the feeling that parts of this game were heavily rushed or flat out unfinished. Both games have detailed worlds that can feel empty in many spots with side quests that look like the developers just dropped a bunch of enemies in an area with little context or thought and called it a side quest to give the players something to do.
Metal Gear and Final Fantasy clearly have content cut to get the game out on store shelves because the publishers need to ship their games at some point. Even the way the pacing of their stories get really weird near the end screams corners were cut. Like MGS5, I think this is where most of Final Fantasy XV's flaws originate from. It's a great RPG that just needed more time in the oven, which is weird saying since this game has been in development for 10 years. I may sound very negative towards this game, but I did enjoy my time with it. Come on, I compared it to Metal Gear Solid 5, one of my favorite games of 2015. It was also my most disappointing game of 2015 by a landslide, but don't worry about that. Final Fantasy 15 wasn't disappointing at all for me. Like I said, it wasn't like I deeply cared about this game for 10 years. Or, it's not like I religiously watched the perfect trailers to this game that were released before its release for 3 years that made the game look heavily story-focused only for the main character to barely speak and the story to be considered shallow at best. That didn't happen. That didn't happen at all.